Holy crap, there is a ton of new subscribers. Welcome to all of you. I have seen a lot of questions surrounding the terms Syncretism, Multi-traditionalism, Reconstructionism, Revivalism, and Eclecticism as of late, so I figured I'd do a quote-unquote quick video defining these various terms so folks can figure out where they fit in the community. What's your approach to paganism? Let's take a look. Kairite! Thank you so much to Serpent Empress for your generous donation of ritual, finance, and politics in ancient Athens. This is a deep dive book that I am excited to get into in order to dig through the interrelationships between these things in ancient Greece and how that might have affected the way that the polis religion works. Thank you so much for your donation. The discussion around the terms Reconstructionism, Revivalism, and Eclecticism has reached a fever pitch for some time in the pagan community, in no small part because of the attitudes of Recon revivalists towards eclectics and vice versa. The idea of the stuffy Recon is forever entrenched in pagan circles, and it's a stereotype that I, Ocean Keltoy, Bjorn, Beafeld, and Wolf the Red have all attempted to break in our own way, in part by trying to make more accessible the various historical practices and methodologies that we've amassed ourselves over the years. The idea of the disrespectful colonialist fluffy bunny eclectic is a similarly popular straw man, and the rather liberal application of the term fluffy bunny in recon circles has played a huge role in this. We'll get to that in a moment. Ultimately, I see the difference between these three groups as one of methodology and the value systems that underline these methodologies. Let's start with the easiest to define, Reconstruction. Reconstructionists, or recons for short, turn to history and scholarship primarily when creating their practice. The value system here being that history and scholarship are the highest authorities in said practices, as the ancients who made first contacts with these gods had success with the methods they employed in contacting them. An example of a Reconstructionist practice in Hellenism would be going to a stream or the ocean to collect water for carnips, or the cleansing solution that one uses to purify oneself before practice. Next is Revivalism, which seeks to update these ancient practices into a more accessible form for modern people. The value system here being prioritizing accessibility of practice to modern practitioners and trying to envision how these faiths, should they have survived into the modern day with modern conveniences, might have evolved. An example of a revivalist practice in Hellenism might be using tap water with a match or sprig of an herb doused in it alongside a prayer to create carnips, or dissolving salt in water for the same prayer to Poseidon. Eclecticism is taking personal experiences or collecting a wide selection of practices, beliefs, and deities to craft a unique personal approach to religion. It stems from the primary valuing of personal experience and utility over everything else when it comes to practice. An eclectic might simply call the gods without using carnips at all, or might use smoking herbs or incense instead of using a liquid to do the cleanse prior to offering, or do something akin to a wicked banishment of negative energy and deem it enough to cleanse. When talking about recon and revivalism, however, you might notice that the underlying value system is the same, and that isn't a coincidence. In my view, Reconstruction and Revivalism is actually a distinction without a difference. The seeming feud between the two seems to have been brought on by differences in opinion between groups and individuals as to how far into modernization reconstructed faith should go, and the difference in terms has been employed to distance stuffy recons from loosey-goosey revivalists. Both distinguish themselves strongly from eclectics, but I've yet to meet a Reconstructionist or revivalist who doesn't have an eclectic practice or belief of some kind. That isn't to say that recons and revivalists are the same as eclectic. The difference between their value systems in practice determination is fairly stark, but it does seem like the line, specifically between recons and revivalists, is drawn where recons think the revivalists stray into eclecticism with their modernization of the faith, even though modernization is an essential part of recon. Faiths are living, and would have modernized if they had been allowed to survive monotheistic hegemony. It is a really silly fight to get into in my view. That said, recons and revivalists also really need to stop judging eclectics. The word eclectic is not a frickin' slur. Having a difference in value system is fine so long as the eclectic isn't trying to force their practices or views on you as the one right or only way to do things, or use their personal experiences to paint themselves as an authority or avatar of a deity. If the gods have a problem with it, they will let the person know. We don't need to be the mediators in other people's practices and beliefs. It becomes harmful when supremacy is declared on either side, and I've seen recons and revivalists attack eclectics and vice versa over what amounts to a difference in methodology and values. Both are valid. Which brings me to the term fluffy bunny. Although I don't want to get too deep into it in this video, it is a term that gets thrown around in recon circles against eclectics, in my opinion, far too liberally. To me, someone becomes a fluffy bunny when they try to apply pseudoscientific justifications to their practices, such that those practices become harmful. Attacking someone with UPG-based eclectic practices when they're not claiming some sort of historical or scientific authority behind them is not a productive use of anyone's time. If what someone is doing is not being used as a weapon or causing harm in any way, it's not up to us to police how they practice. This accusation can also be leveled against atheopagans for their beliefs and practices, as well as atheopagans attacking polytheists for ours out of a sense of orthodoxic purity. I already did a whole ass video on pagan orthodoxy, link is in the iCard above if you missed it. Every religion was eclectic at some point in history. There wasn't always a traditional entrenched way to deal with the gods, and within Hellenism even, you can see a millennia of evolution in personal and polis religion just by looking at the changes from archaic to the Hellenistic era. This brings me to Syncretism, which is combining gods or traditions into your religion or practice. This can take multiple forms. One example would be my buddy JACandQuill, who worships the Roman goddess Fortuna in the heathen way with a heathen ritual structure. Another would be the folding of a whole tradition into another, as was done with the pre-Hellenistic Roman, Kemetic, and Hellenic religions during the Hellenistic era. One could argue that the whole of Roman religion during the Roman Empire was a massive example of syncretism. As they conquered areas, they used a system called Interpretatio Graeca to fold deities, practices, and stories into their own faiths. The Greek magical papyri were written by Egyptian priests serving the Roman gentry and often applied the methodology of Heka to the Greek gods. Still, another way one might be syncretic would be taking a specific tradition from another religion and integrating it into your own, such as a heathen integrating Greek veiling into their practice to honor their gods, or a Hellenist using the I Ching to contact Apollon or the dead. Finally, in history, stories were often combined or adopted syncretically when ancient cultures came into contact, such as Aphrodite acquiring some of the characteristics of Ishtar after Eastern contact, or the Buddhists of certain regions of India declaring that Heracles was a guardian of the Buddha. As you can see, history shows that syncretism was common and even expected within various faiths. When cultures intermingle and intermarry, customs, beliefs, and stories are bound to mingle and shift as well. There's a debate in the community about the reconstruction of ancient syncretic faiths, such as those practiced in the Hellenistic era. In my view, if the syncretism is a recorded historical practice, then it's simple recon and doesn't necessarily have to be labeled as syncretism by the modern practitioner. In other words, a reconstructed syncretic practice or religion is still reconstructed. Some who feel called from multiple gods or who grew up in a religion different from the one they're called to later take a different approach, known as multi-traditionalism. This is where they would practice two or more distinct traditions while keeping them separated. The reasoning for this is varied, but often comes down to the simple fact that when syncretism happens, something is always lost. I'm actually a multi-traditionalist myself. I've mentioned several times that my family taught me bits and pieces of Haida faith growing up as part of the culture while I stayed with my great-aunt, aunt, and grandma on Whidbey Island. The level of trust and assumed benevolence in worshipping the Greek gods is considered to be a bit dangerous in the Haida tradition, as spirits don't always have your best interest at heart, and neither do the gods. In my mind, these things are incompatible, as treating the Greek gods with that level of distrust would weaken or eliminate the cycle of charis as perceived in Hellenism, whereas it creates an element of danger in Haida practice. Because I don't find these things to be acceptable, I practice these faiths separately, despite believing fully in both. Although that may appear to be a desire for purity between the two, it's more one of preservation. Preserving the cycle of charis and that concept is important to me, and if you're curious as to why, my video on charis as the core of ancient reciprocity is linked in the iCard above. Likewise, my Haida traditions are dying, and preserving the core element of vigilance and attention when dealing with entities in the Haida worldview is essential to that practice. Preservation, in my view, is just as worthy a goal as the ideas of convenience and combination in syncretism. In ancient times, a variation on multi-traditionalism would be practiced while traveling in foreign lands. We have multiple accounts of travelers stopping to offer to the local gods in local temples in the local way, then returning to their camps or households when they were staying with and worshipping their own gods in the traditional way. And in the modern day, some religious practitioners from non-recon faiths practice a version of it, such as a Wiccan who practices ceremonial magic as its own separate system, without pulling a silver raven wolf and trying to combine it with their Wicca. Neither methodology is more valid than the other, and both vary from the eclectic approach of honoring whichever gods one chooses in whichever way works best and feels best based on personal experience, though fans of one approach or the other might hurl an accusation of eclecticism as though it were an insult. It's not, by the way, no matter how badly recon egos might like it to be. Ultimately, the difference between multi-traditionalism and syncretism, much like recon versus eclecticism, comes down to what values are being prioritized. Syncretists tend to prefer having a unified system where all the moving parts can be consistent, versus multi-traditionalists tend to want to preserve specifically what is unique between traditions. Eclectics tend to be far less concerned with these ideas overall, as they already value personal experience as the highest highest authority over historical attitudes and practices of any kind. What I want to stress is that although you might predominantly fall into one of these camps with your practice, it's likely that you're not just one of these in terms of how you practice. You might be a recon pagan who syncretizes a deity and gives non-traditional offerings, or have an eclectic cleansing practice that you feel is revealed to you through UPG. If you're trying to find a label, it's best to look at what you value first and foremost when you decide how to practice. If your first priority is history, but you're willing to add UPG eclectic elements if the experience is strong enough, then you're a recon. If your instinct is to fully combine traditions or to fold a god into your existing tradition, then you're probably a syncretist. If you discover a call from deity and immediately begin researching how that deity was honored in history or is being honored by modern folks in the reconstructed faith they come from, you're probably a multi-traditionalist. If you tend to live by the motto, take what works and leave the rest, you're probably an eclectic. Whatever you are within this framework, know that as long as you're not foisting your beliefs and practices onto others as a sole or privileged authority, nor are harming yourself or others with your practice, then your practices are valid. You might get into tiffs, say, with other recons if you're a recon with a practice you claim is historical that turns out not to be, but that simply means the practice is probably not justified under the grounds you thought it was. It doesn't make it invalid, just ahistorical. And syncretism ultimately amounts to how you're willing to shift your values and practice in order to integrate various gods or traditions that you want to incorporate. I personally see human blood sacrifice as being blasphemous from a Hellenic framework, but someone from an Aztec or Sumerian base might see that as a core part of their practice and choose to honor the Greek gods in a syncretic way with their own blood. It's between them and the gods, regardless of how I feel about it, and as long as they're doing so safely, I can't really comment on their decision myself. If the Tewe have an issue, they'll make it known themselves. So, hopefully you've been able to identify where you sit in all this, and put a tractor term to how you've been structuring your practice all this time. Regardless, I hope that this can also help us all come to accept one another's differing approaches. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's wrong. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, shame the subscribe button and reconstruct the pieces of the like from last video. Drop that into the comments and let me know how you see yourself within this framework. Or just tell me that cultural purity and preservation are actually the same thing because you're out to gather the folk and there's nothing I can do to stop you. Special thanks to GaelicNox as always for the channel art. Links are in the description below to their website and Twitter. And special thanks to my patrons. This week's video was in part inspired by discussions in the patron chat and all the wonderful questions you ask week in and week out. Because of you, I can take weeks to work on projects like this and do the extra research needed for videos like my last one on Divine Experience or the ones on votive offerings and Goddess before that. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.